Adventures in Mortuary Archaeology and Commemoration. It's Archaeodeath.
Hey Archaeodeathlings, I want to present in this video my evaluation of the biggest, the best, the most unprecedented and perhaps the ultimate Viking funeral we'll perhaps ever see on TV or film, namely the funeral of Lagertha in Vikings Season 6 Part 1. And I want to evaluate it from an archaeological perspective, following on from my 40 plus blogs and my previous videos, where I'm trying to look at the show not as to diss it as not authentic, but to try and understand how it's operating, both in terms of taking inspiration from Norse saga literature, from visual and archaeological evidence from the Viking Age and its reception into the 12th, 13th centuries, but also how it is true to televisual and filmic representation and our contemporary expectations of what a Viking funeral should be. And I will give you my conclusion right at the start here, that I think that Lagertha's funeral is the ultimate funeral, fulfilling every fantasy that we wish a Viking funeral to be, and probably never was. Okay, but that shouldn't stop us evaluating it and from an archaeological point of view and thinking about how the TV show creates a material world, creates a visual integrity and a story. And I want to proceed by evaluating the funeral according to, I think I've got about 11 points I want to make. That's a lot, so this might be quite a long video, but I hope to rattle through each point. And on the way I will be making critical comments, but I will also be pointing out some really fascinating points that stimulate discussion about the actually what might have happened in the Viking Age and about our expectations today. My first point is about duration. This is perhaps the longest funeral in any TV show. A whole episode, the Ice Maidens, episode 7 of season 6 part 1, is dedicated to Lagertha's funeral. She's dead and frozen and her body's discovered at the beginning of the episode. By the end, the TV episode just ends with the conclusion of the funeral, or the conclusion of the elements of the funeral they want to show. Now, that in itself is a phenomenon. They skip away to Björn on his ship coming back to Kattegat and unaware that his mother has died, and they skip away to look at Kiev and Ivor the Boneless poncing around in Kiev and Russia, trying to plan a re-invasion of Scandinavia. And with that plot line is I won't even comment on, but the fact is about 35 minutes of the whole episode, perhaps 32 minutes, somewhere around there, is the funeral, and let that sink in. And that's really an important point. So regardless of what else you think of the content, the settings, of anything else that's shown in the episode, the TV show has paid due respect and attention to funerals as performances, as memorable events, and memorable not just for those people that were there, but to be transmitted down the generations. And that's made very clear at the very end of the funeral that Orsa, the granddaughter of Lagertha, is the child aged, what is she supposed to be, about 5 or 6, who is going to remember this funeral for the generations that weren't alive to experience it. So the idea is this is supposed to be a spectacle, a once in a lifetime event, in fact a once in multiple generations event of a theatrical elite funeral burying a unique individual. And Torvi says in the we want a funeral like no other to be remembered by our folk, or something like that. In other words, the whole TV show is aware that this is not supposed to be typical. This is exceptional, it's unique, and it's something unprecedented and never to be repeated. And I think that's important for our thinking about what this TV show is trying to do. This isn't showing us how Viking queens were buried, even if it was trying to show us the 9th century, and it's not. It's about the legendary world of the fictional characters, as recorded in sagas and dramatized in a 21st century TV program. But it's not even trying to show us that. It's making clear this is supposed to be exceptional, even for its time, and the duration is key to that. This is supposed to be a drawn out event. Now, from the historical sources, we know from Ibn Fadlan's account in the early 10th century, 10 days the corpse was buried to prepare for the funeral. In that context, this is actually quite a brief funeral, but the whole idea is that this is supposed to be a substantial amount of time, at least a whole day dedicated to it, and we're left to infer there were previous and subsequent ceremonial activities framing the actual decking of a ship and its cremation, which is what we're going to focus on now. So the first point I want to emphasize is the show doesn't, let's get it wrong or right, but it does make a deal out of the duration and scale of the funeral for Lagertha. It is to be like no other and never to be repeated, and to be conveyed down the generations for the duration and the scale of the event. So that's the first point. And it's a link to that. My second point is it's a funeral that is spread over multiple locations, while most of what we see is taking place by the side of a secluded fjord, away from Kattegat. Kattegat is where everyone has come from in procession. We don't see the procession, but it's implied. And it's also implied that the entire population of Kattegat and perhaps surrounding villages, farms, steads are emptied. Those settlements are emptied to the whole. Everyone's come to the funeral. Now, whether that's realistic or not, it does impress upon us the scale and the procession that is not shown in season 4. Aslog's funeral is shown with a procession. We're not shown it, but it implied in what we see is that there's been a long procession from Kattegat and perhaps from elsewhere, bringing goods, bringing horses, bringing sacrificed animals, bringing people to this event. So the first point is the duration. The second point is the landscape scale. My third point is about the landscape setting of the funeral that we actually see. We see a processional route winding down the hillside, framed by flags on poles, and we see a sort of staging area on the edge of the iced over fjord where there seems to be ceremonial activity. There's evidence of burning. We're given a hint that there's been previous activity here leading up to the ship's presentation. We're also not really clear how the ship gets to be there and how that fits into the whole affair, but that the very presence of a ship implies it got there somehow, and a journey, either portaging or some kind of moving of that ship to that location. It doesn't make sense, but we have various spatial journeys, spatial interactions evoked. Well, the ford itself the fjord itself is a kind of odd location, and we'll come back to the fact that we have no evidence people are being burnt on ships or even set off into the sea as a funeral rite. This is something that comes to us through various later legendary sources. We have Sjoerd Schiefing in the start of the epic Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. We have various allusions to death by bad seamanship or death by old vessel in some of the sagas, and we have the prose Edda, funeral of the god Balder, where the gods assemble with the giants and they push it out and burn him on a fiery ship. But we don't have any real world evidence that this was a funerary practice, but the fjord provides a landscape scale setting where a large crowd can gather, and I think that's important to mention, as well as the fact that we don't have really any evidence of funerals on water. But throughout the show there is an integrity to the fact that they've shown again and again funerals taking place beside water. Water is always there as part of the framing of a funerary scene. So in all those aspects, it's really interesting. I want to comment also on the ship in the funeral of Lagertha, because the ship is not simply a stage. It becomes a stage which is decked in flowers, and there are chests and boxes, a bed with furs placed onto the ship, the personal items of the deceased, sacrificial offerings. No animals are sacrificed on the ship, as would probably have been the case in a funerary context before cremation or inhumation. But there's animal rights issues there that could forgive the filmmakers for not doing that. But there is a slave girl who goes into the ship. But the ship is more than a stage. The ship has a biography of its own, because it's Lagertha's ship, and we've seen it from at least season 2, I think, maybe season 3, as the principal vehicle for her adventures, her deeds, her fame is embodied and encrusted upon the ship. So the fact that this particular ship is the receptacle of her body for going out on her last journey is not arbitrary at all. It also has stakes around it with animal heads put on it. We don't know what's going on there because some of them are skulls, some of them are still fleshed goats or sheep's heads. Others seem to be a deer and their skulls, and that has integrity within the history of the funerals as portrayed in the TV show. Because earlier we see Sigurd Snake in the Eyes funeral has animal heads, skulls, sorry, facing outwards, almost protecting the ship like spiritual guardians. And we have that again in the funeral of those killed in the fight for Lagertha's settlement, but we don't really understand where the inspiration for that idea is from, other than animal skulls seem to be a generic displayed on halls, displayed on funerals, pagan thing, and animal bones seem to be in long animal vertebrae and long strings linking the ship to the land. So it's almost the idea they're playing with here is that animal bone is an interface between the supernatural world and this world, and cultic characters, including the priest, seem to have them running down their backs. So there's some kind of idea here that animal bone is a divinatory or intercessory material culture, which is interesting, if not fully demonstrable in the archaeological record. It's true to the story. We've seen that from season 1 onwards. It's true to the integrity of the show that's a way they show funerary or cultic environments. So that's all very interesting. The ship has a biography, and the preparation of the ship goes beyond flowers and the bed, and it also goes to weapons. So Lagertha is given a weapon burial. Aslog, even though she'd never used weapons, is given a weapon burial, but Lagertha is also given a weapon burial, given her shield maiden status, but also her queenly status, her war leader status. This all fits into her personal biography and therefore has integrity within the storyline, although of course there are debates about whether Lagertha has any real world was there a real world versions of the Lagertha character? In my opinion, no. But in terms of the integrity of the storyline, this fits right in and makes sense. As I said, there's no animal sacrifice seems to have happened, and then we have this wonderful, disturbing scene of 4 horse heads seen from above with an archaeological bird's eye perspective, showing you that horse sacrifice was an integral part of stages of the funeral not shown. And again, I think it's really good that the way that we're made very clear in the TV show that we're not seeing everything, even though we're seeing a whole episode worth of funeral. We're only seeing snapshots, and I think that's a really wonderful way of doing it. But we see chickens go past in the preparation stages of the funeral, but there's other things that aren't shown. Odd in its absence are dogs. The whole TV show has hardly any dogs. It's really weird. Dynamic, and again, animal rights things here, but they're not killing any dogs. They should be cutting dogs in half. If this was a Viking funeral of any status, they should be sacrificing dogs as guardians, as guides, as protectors for the dead. You'd expect dogs, and you expect people to have had dogs in life. You know, if you're of any status, you'd expect a pack of dogs, and you expect some of them to have been joining the person in their funeral. They're not there. Birds, as I said, apart from the chicken that goes past, we don't know what happens to that poor beast. There's no birds there. So animals as companions for the dead are not really articulated. Lagertha was a member of the elite, and you'd expect her to be riding to Valhalla, and she's not given a horse. There's horses are sacrificed, but the horses don't go with her onto the ship. So none of this really makes sense in terms of what we know from the archaeological record, but it does link into the horse sacrifice is shown at Aslog's funeral, and that allusions to that are shown in this funeral. So there is a integrity within the series itself. So I've gone through duration, scenes, landscape, ships, the preparation of the ship, and animal sacrifice. That's 6 points. Human sacrifice. Now here again, we see inspiration from the account of Ibn Fadlan, and we see the idea that human sacrifice is an exceptional practice for an elite funeral, and no attempt is made to show that this is typical. It's supposed to be unusual, exceptional, even in the context of this society and for an exceptional context. What is really perhaps odd and disturbing and perhaps really problematic is the way that the sacrifice is not being simply made as with Earl Haraldson's funeral in season one, a voluntary aspect of a slave girl. It's actually taken to another level, that one of the shield maidens who treat Lagertha as her queen, almost like a abbess in a cult of Freya, agrees to go into the ship, and there's a whole random scene taking place in the hall at Kattegat where a raven lands on her shoulder and almost chooses her. So Odin or Freya is choosing her as the sacrificial victim, so she doesn't even choose herself really, so a raven does it. I don't know where that comes from, if anywhere, from the Norse sagas, and I defer to others who are more expert than I to comment on that. But I would say that this is taking it down a strange rabbit hole of the idea of human sacrifices done by free individuals as a voluntary dedication to go off with the dead. Torvi volunteers herself, and Gunhild says no, because you're pregnant. We won't go that far, but we're happy to let other people go down that route. So human sacrifice goes in an odd direction here. But the other thing that's really most disturbing is not the choice of free thinking individuals to volunteer, but the fact that this all happens in the hall. The sex doesn't happen as some kind of celebratory thing with drink and drugs in different tents, as in Ibn Fadlan's account, or indeed in the funeral of Earl Haraldsson. It's not the elite men, it's just these random young topless dudes turn up and shag this woman on the floor of the hall surrounded by priests. No idea where that comes from. It's utterly weird. It's trying to be weird. It's trying to be annoying. And I have nothing further to say about that, other than it totally misses the point that all this stuff should be happening out with a broader audience, not in a hall. So the angel of death killing the woman in the most gruesome fashion, and oddly giving her the choice of whether she dies by garrote or knife rather than doing both. None of that really chimes with anything we understand, what little we understand about human sacrifice, as appearing in the story of Ibn Fadlan recounts of the Rus on the river Volga. So it's all a bit weird and off and disconnected. And yes, the body of that woman appears in the ship. We don't know how she gets there. She put perpendicular to the body of Lagertha at the end of the ship. But her role as a performer, she looks up into the hall. She's raised up by the men and sees Lagertha and beckoning to her from the next world, which is exactly what happens, or partly happens, in Ibn Fadlan's account. But in this, there's no audience for her proclamation of seeing Lagertha in the afterlife. So it's kind of completely lost. So there's lots of things that don't really quite work about human sacrifice. In fact, so my 8th point relates to audience of Lagertha's funeral. As I've said, there's a huge amount of people there. More than that, this is really emphasised by the fact that Björn arrives in Kattegat late, or not late because he doesn't know the funeral's happening. He arrives at Kattegat and finds the settlement deserted, a settlement we've seen burgeon since season 1, develop from a small settlement around a chieftain's hall to be a major emporium serving the large tracts of territory, the focus of an earldom and then a kingdom, and it's empty. It's completely empty because of Lagertha. Around the fjord side, we're seeing this huge crowd, warriors, men, women, children, no animals, no dogs, of course, which is another bizarre thing, but a huge crowd watching on. So as well as the processions we haven't seen, and the other aspects of the sacrifices we haven't seen, we are given the sense of an empty settlement, drumming and cheering, no real dancing or singing, no proper singing. There's a lament by Torvi, but it's really a half-assed. No one's going to hear it. There's no proclamation. There's no master of ceremonies. There's no individual performances. No group performances. Everyone just does a bit of a jig. Even the priests get involved. There's a bit of boom, 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 boom. There's no real entertainment. And the odd thing about this huge crowd standing for maybe hours by a freezing cold fjord side is they have no There's no games, there's no feasting, and there's no drinking. No one's getting drunk. And that is really odd from what we know of Ibn Fadlan's account and from what we anticipate about the provisions for the dead. Feasting is a major feature. That's why they're killing the animals. They're not just killing the animals to be companion animals. They're killing them as part of the sacrifice, the public sacrifice of the wealth of the dead person and his or her family. So the fact there's none of that makes it a very odd Viking funeral, a very puritanical Viking funeral, because from what we understand, funerals are massive celebrations, explosions of sexual and violent and entertaining activity. They're all about energy and vitality. So it's really odd that all of that is missing from Lagertha's funeral. And that, I've already gone into it. That leads to my 9th point. I think I'm up to 9th point, which is the fact that the performers are disconnected. We have the Angel of Death, who really should be the master or mistress of ceremonies, and yet she only appears and performs the role of killing the slave girl in a reasonably private cultic space, taking over the hall in Kattegat. She doesn't appear at the funeral by the fjord. So that's really odd. And instead, male priests, the Viking TV show's version of pagan priests is sort of baldies, older men. We never appear anywhere out of the show, but have face paint, white and black and red at different times. But they appear in groups and surround the ship. And they're the closest things we have a sense of the occultic role in the funeral. We don't know what they do. They don't seem to guide anyone or direct anyone to do anything. We then have a private sort of modern day graveside farewell in the fact that Uber, Gunhild and Torvi go onto the ship and have a private conversation with the corpse, which is sort of it's really much about us and our need as an audience to say goodbye rather than anything we know about happening in the Viking Age. No one can hear what they say, it's private. And at one level that's quite good, because you see the crowd are through distance, they're involved, they're attending the funeral, but they're shown, they're aware there are bits that are private, that are not a part of their hearing and in their sight line. And it's a very personal and tear-jerky sort of farewell from all of those three individuals. But they don't get involved in telling the rest of the audience what they've been saying. So it's a bit disconnected. The private goodbyes are very much for our benefit, but they don't really fit into what I think we understand. And perhaps that's one of the things that's unsatisfying about our understanding of Viking funerals, is we don't have that intimate connection. And I think it works for us in the sense that we have that, we see the performance and then we see the intimate goodbyes, but I don't think it really is resolved in the TV show funeral. And linked to that, when Björn turns up late, he should be the chief funeral. He's the only biological son of Lagertha. He should be taking over the funeral, lighting the pyre, and he doesn't. He just sits down. He doesn't even approach the corpse. He doesn't approach the ship, and he lets the shield maidens do the work for him. And he professes his love for his mother, and that's really revealing. But it's really inadequate. It really doesn't work. He should be. If this was that poser from The Last Kingdom, it would be a good excuse for him to strip naked and waltz across the ice and light the pyre himself, because that's what backwards, so everyone can see his genitalia, because that's what would happen according to the funeral in the Ibn Fadlan account. Is that the chief mourner approaches the pyre backwards and covering his bottom for reasons that aren't fully explained, and lights the pyre. And they don't want to do that. We don't have male nakedness in this one. It's too cold. Well, make of that what you want, but Björn doesn't get involved. So there's no real performers in the funeral. There's no real key agents who are directing the narrative of Lagertha's life. And it works for us maybe as viewers, but it's very disconnected. Point 10 then is the cremation itself. My word. So in the event, let's make it a fantasy world where they were cremating. Let's imagine a Viking Age where they were cremating people on boats and pontoons. You'd need a pyre in the ship to burn the body before the boat itself burns. They don't seem to be able to do that. It's on water, which is implausible. It's not impossible, and it may have happened, but we don't know it happened. There's no archaeological way we can find out this was happening regularly, and I just don't think it's a plausible way of death. It speaks much to our expectation of Viking funerals than anything to do with what we have evidence for in the Viking Age. They've got it on water or on ice, which is something I'd never even thought about before, and it's wonderful in that regard that they've thought of something that really jars with my expectation. Would you cremate the dead on thick, sea ice? I mean, it's possible if you built a big pyre, and then everything would collapse through the ice. And they take that idea, but then they don't build a pyre. So she's burning on a bed with a bit of bundles of straw around her, from all I can see. There's no animals. There's no tent. So we see the body on a bed, but there's no tent, as we know from the ship burial at Osabeya, and indeed from the Ibn Fadlan account that the dead is being put asleep in a chamber or in a tent on the ship, and that isn't shown. But then there is the wonderful point where they again, it's utterly implausible. They haul the boat out with shield maidens and horses, pulling the boat over, breaking the ice, while flaming arrows pierce the ice, and they have these ballista bolts piercing the ice on the cliff tops. Now, if they'd used those ballistas, if they had ballistas, and they were using these massive, great crossbows, giant crossbows like the Roman army had, if they had those at the siege of Paris, then the Vikings would have been unstoppable, and they would have kicked Frankish ass. But they don't. They seem to have reserved them only for this funeral scene and for trying to break sea ice with... Why? Anyway, if they'd had a pyre and the pyre had burnt, the ship had burnt, it had broken the sea ice, and the whole thing had collapsed in a mess through the sea ice, that would have been a thing. It would have been a distinctive thing. I'm not so sure it would work, and I'm not sure it would have had any historical veracity, legitimacy, but it would have been a thing. But they try to pull the boat. They've pierced the ice, and then they haul the boat, the Cremation, and the boat breaks and drops in to the water. I think it's utterly implausible, but it's distinctive, it's theatrical, and it takes Viking funerals in a direction that they haven't been before. And that's the point for the TV show. They've done almost everything before, shown us the variety of death ways. They have to go somewhere new, and they take it in with ice and fire coming up against each other, and they do it in a fjord, but with the ship breaking up and going through the ice. So it's exceptionally wonderful and theatrical and utterly implausible and detached from anything we know from sources, archaeological or otherwise. And that's becomes my 11th point, which is the what happens, the imagined body of Lagertha dropping through and transforming back through the stages of her life to become the simple farmer's wife, and to lie on the fjord bed with the sort of spectral Ragnar, and then they all evaporate and go away. And while there's these the white horses, spirits of Valkyries maybe, are riding around underwater, and we're into interesting territories, because all of this is seen by Orsa, the grandkid, who looks through the ice and sees this happening. And so you're almost in the imagination of a young child who is looking on to, remembering, perhaps as an old woman, remembering this funeral of her grandmother. And in that sense, I think it's lovely and fantastical. But of course, again, departs from anything we might even begin to speculate about Norse beliefs in what actually happens when you cremate the dead, and where their bodies goes. And certainly, if they were cremating the dead over water, I mean, how does that link into an eschatology of journeying by just evaporating while Valkyries ride around you? None of it really makes sense, but I love the dynamic of Orsa, the child, the young child, seeing this. That's her vision of what is happening to her grandmother. rather than it being anything that's actually happening. And like all of the supernatural interactions in the TV show, you're left with that idea that I think it's very well done in that sense, that you're left with the idea this isn't really happening. This is what the characters might imagine is happening. So the Viking funeral of Lagertha is the ultimate Viking funeral for our expectations. It works wonderfully as an extension and elaboration of the genre since Einar's funeral in 1958, The Vikings, but particularly within the historical material world created by the TV show, this fictional world. We've already seen so much variety in Deathways, and this is the next stage. And as Torvi says, this is an unprecedented funeral. This is to be something that we've never seen before, and they achieve it. So they do something that hasn't been done before on our TV spectacle of Viking funerals, and it hasn't been done in the TV show. So it succeeds and is therefore, in my view, the ultimate Viking funeral for our expectations and demands and needs. And yet, of course, it's little to do with the archaeological context and archaeological reality. So the Viking funeral that we see with Lagertha has some of the components, the building blocks of Viking elite funerals that we have in the archaeological record: ship, animal sacrifice, weapons, ceremonial processions, but it lacks so much else. It lacks a funerary monument, it lacks a burial site, it lacks that post-funeral aspects. It also lacks booze, it lacks celebration, it lacks gaming, it lacks that broader social context. And it is a world of fantasy. In that sense, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that it's taking us in a very interesting direction, and we need to be aware of that direction and the many benefits of things it raises and what it reveals about the scale and character and tempo of funerals, which is inspired by the sources, but also many of the ways in which this is an inadequate portrayal of a funeral as we would infer them from the archaeological evidence and from 9th century material remains. There's the components are there, but they're not even in the right order or in connection with each other, and therefore it pushes us to think of what a funeral would actually have looked like. Maybe it would have had some of these exotic and scary and disturbing dimensions, including human sacrifice, but maybe it would have many other things. So in many ways, this is a funeral of compromise for our sensibilities, and it's a funeral that's outlandish and exotic also for our sensibilities, some of which is inspired by the saga literature from the archaeological and visual evidence we have, but much of it is a pastiche of TV funerals and fitting our expectations as TV viewers. Much of that will be obvious to anyone who's literate in TV funerals and in archaeological evidence, but I think it's worth summarising and giving this time and attention to such an exceptional funeral. To have a TV show, a hit TV show, dedicate a whole episode to a funeral is astounding, and it's a real opportunity for us to think as archaeologists and academics more broadly about how death is operating in popular culture and how this TV show works to allow funerals to be a focus of conversation, of discourse, in a way that many other genres don't allow. And so I think this fantasy, fictional, historical drama, whatever you want to call it, funeral is doing something in our society very, very interesting, and I'd be interested to see how this develops and is taken on board by other TV shows, and how the Vikings and other barbarians and other historic period funerals become more and more prominent. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeo Death video, why not check out the Archaeo Death blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.